Well, folks, it's Friday afternoon. I hope you've had a really beautiful week. And from my house to yours, I just want to say, Ellen sila lumen omentielvo. Okay, I really hope I got that right. I'm definitely no expert in Quenya, which is the High Elvish language of Lord of the Rings, but I have dabbled in it for reasons that will soon become apparent on this episode of Words, Words, Words. On Fridays, if we've got nothing else going on the schedule, I like to just take your questions about translation and languages and how languages work. There's all sorts of fascinating byways that we can go down that are really revealing of more than just language. Language touches on philosophy, it touches on history, it touches on our nature as human beings, and I think it's also central to good theology as well, to think about how language works and what it means that we are language-using creatures. So as always, send me your questions about language to rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You can DM me there. You can write back in response to my Friday newsletters, but you got to be a subscriber, either a paid or a free subscriber, to ask a question. And I welcome all questions of all kinds, but especially questions about language and translation, which is why I'm excited to take this question from Leo. Leo watched last week's interview with Colin Gorey about Oswald Bera and this new exciting, I think, book for learning Old English. I genuinely believe it will revolutionize Old English learning. I know that's kind of a niche subject, but it's an important subject, and Colin has done something really fantastic with this book. You should go listen to that interview. I will link to the pre-order for that book in the description of this episode. But you guys really seem to like Colin, and I don't blame you. I got a lot of messages about how interesting that dialogue was and just what a cool guy he is. And one thing I think that is awesome about what he's doing is he's really connecting with incredibly difficult subjects, advanced linguistics, but he's doing it in a way that connects so directly to our actual experience of real life. He talked about J.R.R. Tolkien just as easily as he talked about Beowulf, and I think that's the wave of the future when it comes to advanced scholarship. We have a decaying academy in this country and around, I think, the modern West. There's really no denying it at this point that the institutions of higher learning, which are supposed to represent the best of our intellectual tradition, have in many cases, not all cases, but many cases, abandoned their responsibility. And that means that there are a lot of fields, social science, for example, where you can find better information, better data, better research, and better analysis by following some random pseudonymous guy on X than you can by listening to whatever politically motivated study Ketanji Brown Jackson happens to be citing today. Now, there are pitfalls with this. There is no question that there's also danger in the Wild West of social media. You have to have a good apparatus for checking your sources. You have to have some training and savvy and awareness about what sorts of things are legitimate and what's just AI generated flotsam or what's politically motivated deceit even on social media or especially on social media. You do have to have a good BS detector, but generally I actually think we as a society are developing those sorts of tools and tactics and BS detectors that we need to sort through the garbage, and we've been trained in it because our official sources of information have become so untrustworthy that we've actually had to develop a certain degree of personal authority over sifting the wheat from the chaff. And ultimately, this is a good thing. It's not that it doesn't come with its dangers, but it's a good thing because it means that we can find people like Colin who are not in it for credentials or for prestige, but are actually just there for love of the game. And that's what distinguishes this new generation of scholars, I think, that you can find online. Some of them do have posts at official universities, some of them don't. Some of them are in think tanks, and some of them are just out there in the wild, sort of free range, as my friend Mary Harrington, I think, has called it. But we're all here because, not because we wanted to make a name for ourselves in some fancy academy, but because this stuff actually matters to us. And Colin is a great example of somebody who has taken that to a very, very high degree of achievement, but always remained rooted in the realities and the exciting things that really first got us passionate about this in the first place. And that's what I hope to bring you as well here, is I hope to be talking to you about, the good, the true, and the beautiful, but from the perspective of a guy who just happens to have followed that thread through his whole life out of sheer love. I'm not some guy that wants to sell you on a particular political program or whatever. I'm your friendly neighborhood book bro. And so I want to take this conversation forward with the question that Leo has asked about Lord of the Rings, because when we talked about Old English, we talked about the fact that Tolkien took a lot of Old English inspiration for the names and the story and even some of the languages in Lord of the Rings. And Leo says, I was reminded in this of a letter from Tolkien to his son Christopher, where he discusses the fact that his primary interest in history is learning the origin of words. As such, he claims that when asked if Lord of the Rings was an allegory for anything, he said that the whole endeavor was to create a situation in which a common greeting would be Ellen sila lumen omentielvo, a star shines upon our meeting. That's what I said at the beginning to welcome you into this episode. A star shines on our meeting. This is an elvish greeting. And what Tolkien is basically saying here is that in some ways, the whole giant adventure of Lord of the Rings is just backdrop for the idea of this language. What would the world be like where we talk this way? And if you think about it, that's true. You can ask that question about any greeting. If you think about, why do we say hello when the Hawaiians say aloha, right? There are implications, social, cultural, historical implications to even our most basic words. And sometimes our most basic words are particularly interesting in this respect. And Leo is asking whether I have any context to add to this or anything more to say about it. And I definitely do, especially because I have just had, pretty recently, for the first time in my life, the experience of creating a language all my own. And I thought I could just talk to you a little bit about what that experience was like and what it taught me about this deep connection between language and storytelling. Why is it that people who make up fantasy worlds also feel like they have to make up fantasy languages? Like, this is actually some kind of an essential component to what we now call world building, which Tolkien in large part sort of invented, this idea of building out an entire fictional atmosphere so that it's not just one story you're in, it's a whole imaginary universe. Why is that universe not complete without a language? Or if you want to go a step further and take Tolkien's line here as Leo represents it, right? Why is it that whole universe almost exists as defined by its language? Its language is in some ways the fruit or the flower of everything that it is. So let me tell you about my experience creating a language. I made up actually a number of different fake languages for a series that the Daily Wire is producing. It's called Pendragon. It's based on a series of novels, and it's about the Arthurian romances. So it takes place in a kind of mythological old Britain. And part of it is about the Christianization of Britain. I actually haven't seen the whole series. I've only seen the parts that I worked on. But the basic idea, I think, is that this is pre-Christian Britain as Christ comes to Britain, and King Arthur and Merlin are important central figures in that story. And I did some interviews, some behind-the-scenes stuff about that process that you can find. I will link to that as well in the description here of kind of how I built this language. But to give a little more context here for the Young Heretics fans, one thing that immediately struck me, and here I have to give a little bit of a confession. Okay, I have not always been a big Tolkien fan. I've said this before on the show, but one reason why I've sometimes found Tolkien a little bit much is because I actually didn't see why you needed to go into all of this background detail about the world. I'm used to the classic novel that begins and ends, and we understand that there's a world represented by the novel, but we don't necessarily want to find out about what the corn laws are like in this imaginary world. If it's a story about romance, I don't want a 5-page excursus on say, the parliamentary debates that they just had in this world over fishing rules, right? And so it all started to feel to me a little bit like the Simpsons episode where they parody the episodes 1, 2, and 3 of Star Wars. And there's a scene where they're all in that giant parliament building, the Republic building in Star Wars, where they make the laws, and a giant one of those walkers, the frost walkers from the original trilogy, comes bursting in through one of those big machines, like bursts in through the wall, and then it sits down and it puts on its glasses and takes out a sheaf of paper and starts to refer to like subsection code 3. So that's kind of was my initial feeling about Tolkien that makes me a little bit resistant. Is like, why do we need to get bogged down in these minutiae? Just tell the story. The minute I sat down to start translating stuff for into Atlantean, which is the fake language that I made for Pendragon, the minute I sat down to do that, I instantly got why Tolkien did this. It was like a light switch went on in my head, and I was like, oh, this is like crack cocaine. This is so much fun. This is a high. and it's partly because I've loved languages all my life, and I've studied different forms of language, and I love seeing how different languages solve the problems of communication in different ways, like how Japanese has a different way of organizing time than Hebrew does, and Hebrew has a different tense system for organizing time than English does, and they all kind of look at the world from different angles, and suddenly you get to create your own version of that. And that instantly becomes this little thread that you tug on, that you realize you can just keep unraveling that thread forever and ever and ever, because every question that you have to answer about this imaginary language leads to another imaginary question about this imaginary language, and you suddenly discover that language building is world building. And let me say a little bit more what I mean by that. So the technical term for making up a language is conlanging. And ever since Tolkien, there have been different people that have done it in different ways. There's a guy who wrote, I think, a really worthwhile book about it called David Peterson. And the book is called The Art of Language Invention. And Peterson created Dothraki for Game of Thrones on HBO. So he has a lot of high-profile experience in this domain, but he surveys different ways that people have done it. And there are all sorts of approaches people have taken, some of them totally disastrous. And it helps to think about the unsuccessful approaches, or the difficult approaches people have made to language building, because it'll show you some of the issues and concerns involved. So the classic example here is Klingon from Star Trek. If you have ever seen Star Trek, you've probably seen the Klingons. They're the warrior race. Worf, from the one that I really love, The Next Generation, is a Klingon, but they're generally this kind of angry warrior tribe, and they have this language called Klingon, or Klingoni sometimes it's called. And in that language, all the syllables are very rough. There's a kind of soundscape that they were obviously going for to convey that these guys are tough and gruff and nasty, right? And when they first did that, they did not conlang. That is, they didn't sit down and have this sort of big picture think that I had been having about Atlantean. They were just kind of trying to come up with some nonsense syllables, and they just threw some syllables together and put some subtitles. The first time Klingon ever appears in Star Trek, it's just a bunch of nonsense syllables that sound like rah, 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 and then there's a subtitle. When the Klingon became a major part of Star Trek, when they became so popular and they wanted to write more storylines with the Klingons in them, they had to think about adding more Klingon lines. And they suddenly realized that those lines had to be related somehow to these other lines that had just been thought up at random with no particular method to them. And so they had basically the tip of this iceberg. Like, here are a couple sentences that this whole language structure would produce. And they had to go back and reverse engineer the language structure that would produce those sentences and would link them together in some kind of grammatical way, so that then they could generate more sentences that were consistent with the sentences that they'd already written in Klingon. And that's how Klingon was made. It was retroactive, or it was retro-filled into the ones that already existed, into the sentences that already existed. That's not what you want, right? You don't want to start with full, complete sentences. You want to start with the machinery or the source code that can generate as many sentences as you want. And that source code is a grammar and also a vocabulary. Right? You need a big lexicon of words, and you need a structural grammar that can teach you how to form sentences. And in order to do that, you suddenly realize you have to think about how this language came into being. What is the history of this language? And is it related to any other languages that might determine how people form sentences in this language? And for me, that was the most exciting part of the project, because that's where you get to say, okay, so this language, Atlantean, is effectively an almost godlike language. It's the language that is spoken on Atlantis, which in turn is this mythical city that is sort of in the legendary mists of time, almost close to Eden, right? And so what we wanted here was some idea of something, some ancestor of human language that is just on the verge of paradise. And here I started thinking, actually, you know what conlanging is really close to? It's close to the linguistics of somebody like Dante, or these medieval scholars who were thinking about, well, what was the perfect language? What language did Adam speak in paradise, right? And you start to think about, well, what's the, overarching structure of a language that can generate all these other languages? And I realized there was a way here to connect this world of Pendragon into this entire other fictional universe, to do like a giant cinematic universe that includes not just the Pendragon series that Daily Wire is making, but also the J.R.R. Tolkien world of Quenya, where the elves speak the Elvish language, and this is even better, C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, because Lewis in his space trilogy makes a reference to the fact that Numenor might be something like Atlantis, and that Elvish might be something like this other language that his characters speak, which is the unfallen language of Old Solar, the language that all people throughout the galaxy are able to speak, except for humans, because we have fallen. And so what I gradually started to decide is that, okay, the history of this language is actually almost pre-biblical. That is, it goes back to the language that God would have used to speak the world into creation, that is that's sort of gestured or outlined in Lewis's Old Solar, that then ultimately retains traces in Tolkien's Quenya. Now, none of this, by the way, is canon, right? So I don't have the authority to add this to the canon of really any of these properties. This is just my thought process, right? This is just how I'm thinking about where am I going to get the structures that will generate sentences in this language. But you see that question is a question about the imaginary history of this world. And so then I thought, okay, so what happens after this Old Solar language is corrupted by the fall? Well, my idea was it then becomes the father language or the mother language that gives birth to every subsequent human language. And so then I started to think, well, if the past of this language is Old Solar and is the Adamic language that was spoken in Eden, the future of this language is every language that we now speak. And that enables me to start thinking about the actual modern history of linguistics, and it gives me a root, a thing to latch onto in the real world. You say like, okay, this is the language that eventually would form Greek and Hebrew and the biblical languages and all these other modern languages. So how could that have happened? Well, in modern linguistics, we tend to group languages into these giant families based on the idea that many languages which are now separate and distinct have a common ancestor or are related. And so one example of this that's very famous is the idea of Proto-Indo-European, which is this kind of reconstructed, semi-imaginary language. It's almost conlang, but it's not, because it's based on this whole family of languages, including Sanskrit, including Greek, and so on and so forth. Many ancient languages, many modern languages also are supposed to have been descended from this one original language. And it's called the Indo-European family because its current varieties, the current descendants of this one mother tongue, are over the European continent, but also in parts of India. And if you can picture that on a map, there's sort of this big, giant blob of territory where people speak varieties of Indo-European languages. And then there's another family that is also represented in the Bible, but that is totally different and that doesn't have the same set of relationships. So if you think of like Greek and Latin as coming out of that Indo-European world, that's one part of the biblical languages, right? But if you then think about Hebrew, that takes you into the Semitic languages. And this is a whole different set of languages that are all related to one another, but not to the Proto-Indo-European languages in the same way. And you can see it in the structure. So like Hebrew verbs are formed in a way that is totally different from Greek and Latin and French and Spanish and all these other languages. Even though those other languages are all form verbs in sort of similar ways, Hebrew forms verbs rather in a totally different way. But Hebrew is similar to Arabic, and it's similar to a bunch of other languages in the Semitic family, which is in turn part of this larger family called the Afro-Asiatic family. So if you think about Afro-Asiatic, it's Northern Africa plus some parts of what is now Iran, right? And the sort of Middle Eastern part in Asia is where you get that Asiatic side of things. And so you have these two separate family groups that are spoken throughout time and in the ancient world. And my idea was, what if there was a secret third thing? What if there was a one common ancestor above all of these language groups, so that you could think of Atlantean as like the Mac Daddy of all these supposedly unrelated families, right? And that is where I just sort of figured out how Atlantean was going to be formed. And it had to do with taking this story of King Arthur and then plopping it into a larger fictional context with Tolkien and Lewis, but then also connecting that fictional context to modern reality so that there would be a set of linguistic relationships I could use to model my grammar. And so the grammar of Atlantean is rooted, the verbal system is rooted in Hebrew because it uses prefixes and suffixes to convey the subject and the object of the verb. So if you say I do this, then I and this are kind of tacked on to either side of the verb. But a lot of the vocabulary is Greek. Some of the cases, that is the declension of nouns, are taken from Greek, or they're modeled on other Indo-European languages. And the idea would be that you could tell little stories about like, oh, this cluster of words over here has to do with, say, weaponry, and the Greeks inherited that part. So a lot of the words for weaponry in Atlantean are derived from Greek, even though that's retro-engineered to tell the story that the Greek words are actually derived from Atlantean. And you can go sort of through the lexicon of the language and find all sorts of traces. And as I was building the language, every time I had to translate a new sentence, I would kind of tell these little stories to myself about how Atlantean had made contact with all these different ancient civilizations and eventually over time produced all these other languages, with the idea that our languages are distant descendants of the fallen version of Old Solar, which is so much fun and also reveals to you something about the actual reality of language, which is that our languages always carry history with them. So what I'm talking about in my own head is really just my personal process. And again, I talk about this more in the backstage of the Daily Wire, so you can go look that up. But really, this is just my personal process of coming up with a kind of headcanon. And it doesn't even really have to be explicit in the text. It's more something that I'm using as like a mental map for thinking about how I'm going to build this thing. But the reason I do it that way, and I think that Tolkien did something kind of similar, and it's why his world ended up being so built out, is that I'm doing that so that it will reflect how language actually works in the modern day, which is that it arises at the end of a giant story. It's the story that produces the language. And I've told you a lot of those stories here on this show, on these Friday episodes. We talked at great length about, how Old English gives rise to Middle English, gives rise to Modern English. I've talked about all sorts of different etymologies that we get from all over the place, and this is true in every language. And every language itself is a kind of cultural product that emerges out of a story. And that's why we're able to then use all of that cultural baggage and recycle it into a new story. I can use now this English language, which is itself the product of a story, to tell you a story, which is like incredibly cool and very meta if you think about it. And it also explains funnily enough, why Oswald Berra is such an effective teaching tool, because language is not only what we use to tell stories, it's also the marker or the imprint of past stories on us. The fact that I speak English, the fact that I am fluent in English without having to try at it, is itself the imprint of my personal history, my family background, where I came from, right? And the variety, the brand of English that I speak is a kind of story about me. And so when I pick that up, then I'm picking up the whole weight in some ways of my prehistory, and I'm using it to fashion it into another thing. In this case, the story of how I thought about making Atlantean for the Daily Wire and what that tells me about Tolkien and how that reflects on what I was talking about with Colin and all of that stuff. When we use language, when we talk to each other, are not simply conveying factual ideas. We are often conveying propositions and facts, but we are also connecting our stories to one another. We are conveying information about more than just facts. We're conveying something inward about ourselves that we then clothe in this elaborate apparatus that we call language. And that contact that we make is the closest thing we have to soul contact. We can't actually just merge with one another the way the angels merge in Paradise Lost. You know, there's a kind of fusion that they're able to do where they almost connect like two balls of gas, like melding with one another. We can't do that. And so a lot of the point of the prior episodes where I've been talking about Aristotle's theory of language is to say, like, what's our substitute for that? How do I get what's inside of me across to you so that it can be in you as well? And the answer is, like, I have this enormous inheritance, this storehouse that comes carrying the history of every time anybody ever had this particular inner experience. Anytime anybody fell in love is bound up, or anytime at least those who have spoken English have fallen in love, is bound up in the history of the word love and its connection in that word tree to all the other languages. And if you then take that and assimilate other languages to one another in their own family trees, you ultimately end up with, I think, like, basically a universal humanity. You end up with this thing lurking or hovering behind all of the words that we use that is the common store of human experience. And not for nothing, but if I had to guess, that common store, that universal thing, or what Aristotle would call the pathemata tes psyches, the experiences, the inward experiences of the soul, that's just what we are. God has made a world filled with as many different versions of those experiences as there are human beings. And in order to give us to one another, to connect those experiences, he has given us language, some way of reflecting what's going on inside at one another. It's extraordinarily cool. Thank you for this question. As always, don't forget to send me your questions, if you have them, at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I will take all questions related to language and translation on Fridays, and I'll take other questions related to the Odyssey or to stuff that we're talking about on the main episodes every Tuesday in the mailbag. And that too, you can just do on Substack. I will drop links to all the stuff we talked about here in the show notes. I will make also a plea to you to buy my book. If you haven't already, I've loved hearing from you guys about Light of the Mind, Light of the World, and your experience of it so far. This would make, I think, a really good Christmas gift. It's a spiritual book about religion that ends up with the book of Genesis and ends up, I think, being conformable to Christian faith, but it's not only for Christians. I've talked to Jewish people who have enjoyed it, seekers who have enjoyed it. So if you're looking for something to give to a thinker in your life, this book, I think, would make a great one. If you've already read it, I would love for you to give it 5 stars on Amazon. That would help me enormously to get the word out. Thanks, guys, very much for being with me. Don't forget to rate, review, share, subscribe to the podcast, all that good stuff. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.